In 1849, a Missouri homesteader sold a yoke of oxen, half of everything he owned, just to set white sugar, real coffee, and a full barrel of wheat flour on his daughter's wedding table. On the American frontier, a wedding feast was the single most expensive day a family would ever stage. Some saved for years, some went into debt that outlived the marriage itself. Number 14 took 3 women, 2 full days to build, layer by layer, and number 1 was so rare on the prairie that neighbors drove 40 miles by wagon just to taste a slice. These were not just meals, they were a family announcing to the whole valley that they had arrived. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because what these pioneers served will change how you think about a simple piece of cake. Let's count down. Number 25, Switch L, the Haymaker's Punch, was the first taste a guest received as their wagon rolled into the yard. Mixed in a stoneware crock from cold well water, cider vinegar, molasses, and a knob of grated ginger, it was ladled into tin cups and pressed into the hands of travelers who had ridden half a day over rutted trails. On an ordinary afternoon, switchel was what a man drank in the hayfield to keep from fainting in the heat. But on a wedding day, the bride's mother stirred in precious sorghum, or even a spoonful of white sugar, lifting a field hand's drink into something almost genteel. Children begged for the sweet dregs at the bottom of the crock. Oral histories from the Ohio Valley recall the sharp, bright bite of it on a dust-dry throat, the way it announced that the celebration had truly begun before a single dish reached the table. Number 24, sassafras and spicewood tea carried the taste of the woods straight into the wedding clearing. Long before a store-bought leaf ever reached a frontier cabin, families dug sassafras roots from the creek bank in early spring, scrubbed them clean, and simmered them until the kettle ran a deep rosy red. The smell, sweet and faintly medicinal, drifted across the dooryard and mingled with wood smoke. For a wedding, the women sweetened it heavily and served it warm in whatever cups the household could muster, often borrowed from 3 farms over. Diaries from the Appalachian backcountry describe guests cradling the steaming tin, grateful for warmth after a cold morning's ride. It cost a family nothing but an afternoon of digging, yet it spoke of welcome and care. In an age when coffee and proper tea were luxuries, this humble root tea told arriving kin they were among people who would give everything they had. Number 23, watermelon rind. Preserves gleamed on the wedding table like little chips of amber glass, proof that the bride's mother had spent a whole August day refusing to let anything go to waste. After the family ate the red flesh through the summer, the thick pale rind was peeled, cubed, and soaked overnight in lime water to firm it, then boiled slow in syrup spiced with clove and a sliver of lemon, if any could be had. Sugar was dear, so a jar of these preserves represented real sacrifice, set aside for months and guarded in the springhouse for exactly this day. Children eyed the glistening cubes and were warned to take only one. Oral histories from the Carolinas recall the translucent sweetness, faintly tart, a flavor that tasted like patience itself. To serve preserves at all announced that this family had sugar to spare, and on the frontier, sugar was simply another word for wealth. Number 22, spiced pickled peaches sat in their dark syrup like jewels, the most prized jar a frontier woman would open all year. Through the late summer, she pricked whole ripe peaches, studded each with whole cloves, and put them down in crocks with vinegar, cinnamon, and hoarded brown sugar. They needed weeks to mellow, which meant the wedding had to be planned around the canning, not the other way round. When the crock was finally carried up from the cellar and the lid lifted, the whole room caught the scent of clove and warm fruit. Guests speared a single peach onto a plate beside the meat, and the contrast of sweet and sharp against salt ham was the height of frontier sophistication. Settler letters speak of saving the very best peaches off the tree, the unblemished ones, specifically for a daughter's wedding crock. Nothing else on the table said abundance quite so loudly. Number 21, jumbles, the little seed cookies pressed into rings and knots, were the cookies a frontier mother only baked when something mattered. Made from butter, sugar, eggs, and a scattering of caraway or coriander seed, they were rolled thin and shaped by hand into loops before baking on a greased iron sheet. Each ingredient was a small extravagance. Butter churned and saved, eggs that might otherwise have been sold, sugar measured by the spoonful. The dough was worked until smooth, then twisted into shapes that delighted the children who hovered at the table's edge. Recipe sheets copied in faded ink between neighbors show jumbles appearing again and again for weddings and Christmas, and almost never otherwise. Oral histories recall how a tin of jumbles was set out only when company of real importance arrived. Light, crisp, and faintly perfumed with seed, they were the frontier's idea of a fine, fancy biscuit. Number 20, crullers and donuts, fried golden in a deep kettle of lard, filled the wedding yard with a smell that drew children from the far fields. The dough, enriched with eggs and a little nutmeg, was cut and twisted by hand, then dropped into the hissing fat until it puffed and browned. Frying took a fearless cook and a steady fire, for a kettle of hot lard was no small thing to manage outdoors with a crowd underfoot. Drained on clean cloth and dusted with sugar, the donuts vanished almost as fast as they came out. Diaries from the upper Midwest described great heaped platters of them passed hand to hand, the dough still warm. Lard was plentiful after hog killing time, but the eggs and sugar made them a treat. For many a frontier child, the memory of a wedding was forever tied to the smell of donuts frying in the open air. Number 19, soft gingerbread, dark and damp with molasses, was the cake a poor family could still afford to serve with pride. Sweetened not with costly white sugar, but with sorghum and molasses, and spiced with hoarded ginger and a pinch of allspice, it baked up in a heavy iron pan into a moist, fragrant square. The smell alone, warm, spicy, faintly bitter from the molasses, meant a celebration was underway. Cut into generous pieces, it was handed out to the children first, then to the older guests who remembered when even molasses was scarce. Oral histories from the prairie settlements recalled gingerbread as the great equalizer of weddings, served by families who could not dream of a frosted sugar cake, but would not let their daughter marry without something sweet. Dense, sticky, and deeply comforting, it carried the taste of thrift turned tender. Number 18, cracklin' bread turned the leftovers of hog killing into a savory loaf fit for a feast. After the fat was rendered down for lard, the crisp, browned bits left behind, the cracklins, were folded into a stiff cornmeal batter and baked in a screaming hot iron skillet until the crust shattered at the touch. Salty, rich, and studded with pockets of crunch, it carried more flavor than plain corn pone ever could. For a wedding, the cook saved the very best cracklins from the autumn slaughter, kept dry and ready to make a bread worthy of company. Settler recollections from the southern hill country describe the skillet pulled smoking from the coals and the bread broken by hand while still hot. It cost almost nothing, yet tasted of plenty, the kind of dish that said a family had kept its smokehouse full through a hard winter and had something to spare on the happiest of days. Number 17. Beaten biscuits were the proudest bread a frontier kitchen could produce, and the most punishing to make. The stiff dough of flour, lard, and a little milk was laid on a hardwood block or a clean stump and beaten with the flat of an axe or a wooden mallet, sometimes 300 or 400 strokes, until it blistered and turned silky smooth. There was no other way to make them rise light, for they used no yeast and no soda. A bride's family might set a girl or a hired hand to beating dough for the better part of an hour, the rhythmic thump carrying across the yard like a drum. Baked small and hard, they cracked open clean to be filled with a slice of country ham. Oral histories of the upland South speak of beaten biscuits as the test of a serious household. To serve them was to show you had the white flour and the willing arms to spare. Number 16. Sally Lunn was the showpiece bread of the frontier wedding. A tall golden loaf so rich it sat closer to cake than to anything eaten at an ordinary supper. Built from white flour, butter, eggs, and milk, and raised slowly with yeast, it demanded a warm corner and a patient hand, for the dough had to rise twice before it ever saw the oven. Every ingredient was precious. The white flour was hauled by the barrel from the store, the eggs counted out, the butter churned and chilled. Baked in a fluted mold if the family owned one, it came out burnished and high, and the cook turned it out to gasps. Sliced and spread with butter or honey, it tasted of pure indulgence. Diaries describe Sally Lunn as the bread that proved a family had climbed above mere survival, served when only the finest would do, with a daughter's marriage on the line. Number 15. Real coffee, boiled strong in a smoke-blackened pot, was the single most coveted drink on the frontier wedding table. For every day, families scraped by on roasted barley, parched rye, or chicory, pretending to be coffee. But for a wedding, the father made a special trip to the general store and bought green beans by the pound, paying dearly for them, then roasted them himself in a skillet until the cabin filled with a smell that meant something extraordinary was coming. Ground in a hand mill and boiled with an eggshell to settle the grounds, the coffee was poured black and bitter into borrowed cups and treated like liquid gold. Oral histories recall guests savoring it slow, knowing they might not taste true coffee again for a year. To set real coffee before the wedding party was a quiet boast, a way of saying no expense had been spared for this one shining day. Number 14. The apple stack cake was the wedding cake of the mountain frontier, and the whole community built it together. Each layer was a thin, hard cake of molasses-sweetened dough, baked one at a time in a skillet, dark and dry as a cracker on its own. Tradition held that the bride's neighbors and kin each brought a layer to the wedding, and the more layers the bride received, the more beloved and well-regarded her family was thought to be. The stack was assembled tall, sometimes a dozen layers high, with thick spiced apple butter spread between each one. Then it had to sit, often overnight, while the dried apple filling soaked into the dry cake and turned the whole thing moist and tender. Oral histories from Appalachia recall counting the layers as a measure of a bride's standing. 3 women might labor 2 full days over the cakes alone. It was thrift, community, and ceremony pressed into a single towering suite. Number 13. Dried apple fried pies were the handheld treasure of the wedding spread, small half-moons of pastry stuffed with apples that had been strung up and dried in the rafters since autumn. The dried fruit was simmered soft, sweetened, and spiced with cinnamon, then folded into rounds of dough, crimped tight, and fried in lard until blistered and golden. Each one was a little parcel of saved summer, the fruit having hung drying for months against the lean winter in this very day. Children palmed them warm and ran off to the orchard's edge to eat without sharing. Settler accounts describe baskets of fried pies disappearing within the hour, the crust crackling, the filling dark and sweet. They could be made days ahead and carried easily, which made them perfect for a crowd that came from miles around. Humble in the making, they tasted of foresight and a family that planned for joy. Number 12. Chess pie was the frontier answer to a fancy custard, built from the few rich things a careful pantry might hold all at once: eggs, butter, sugar, and a small handful of cornmeal to bind it. There was no fruit, no costly spice, just a sweet, dense, almost caramel filling baked in a single crust until the top crackled. The story went that when a husband asked what was in the oven, the wife said only, "It's just pie," and the name stuck. For a wedding, 2 or 3 might be baked, a real reckless use of eggs and sugar at once. Oral histories from the South recalled chess pie as the dessert that announced a household had risen out of want, able to spend its eggs on pleasure instead of trade. Sliced thin and savored slow, its plain golden richness was, to a frontier guest, the very taste of having enough. Number 11. Sweet potato pie carried the warmth of the root cellar to the wedding table, turning a humble winter staple into something fit for the finest day. Sweet potatoes, dug in the fall and banked carefully in straw to keep through the cold, were boiled soft, mashed, and beaten smooth with eggs, milk, butter, and what sugar and spice the family could spare. Baked in a flaky crust, the filling set into a deep golden custard, fragrant with nutmeg and faintly earthy beneath the sweet. Every household had sweet potatoes, but it took eggs and sugar and a confident hand at pastry to lift them into a proper pie. Diaries from the frontier South describe a row of these pies cooling on the windowsill the morning of a wedding. Comforting, generous, and the color of late afternoon sun, sweet potato pie proved that even the plainest crop could be made to taste like celebration. Number 10. Persimmon pudding gathered the wild taste of the frontier woods into a dark, spiced sweet that few outsiders ever understood. The fruit could only be picked after the first hard frost, when the puckering bitterness gave way to honeyed softness, so the wedding's timing sometimes turned on when the persimmons came ripe. The pulp was pushed through a sieve to remove the seeds, then beaten into a batter with eggs, cornmeal, or flour, sweetening and warm spice, and baked slow until it sank into a moist, almost pudding-like cake. Oral histories from the lower Midwest and the South recall children sent into the woods with baskets the day before a wedding, racing the possums and the deer to the fallen fruit. Served warm with cream poured over, it tasted of the land itself, rich and dark and faintly wild. It cost nothing but labor and luck, yet no bought dessert could match it. Number 9. Syllabub frothed in the borrowed punch bowl like a cloud, the most dainty and ladylike thing a frontier woman could set before her guests. Fresh cream was whipped with sugar, a squeeze of lemon or a splash of cider, and a generous pour of brandy or wine until it billowed into a soft, boozy foam. Each ingredient was a luxury at once, the cream skimmed from the best milk, the sugar measured carefully, the spirits poured from a bottle kept for special days. Spooned into small glasses or cups, it was sipped and eaten both, delicate and heady. Diaries from the wealthier frontier households describe syllabub as the drink that separated a fine wedding from a merely good one, served to the women and the honored elders. Light as air, yet rich as silk, it was a deliberate echo of genteel Eastern parlors, transplanted by a family determined to show that refinement had reached the prairie too. Number 8. Boiled custard and floating island brought a touch of pure elegance to the wedding board, a dessert that demanded both costly ingredients and a nervous, watchful cook. Milk and cream were heated gently and thickened with beaten egg yolks and sugar into a pale, silken custard that would curdle in an instant if the fire ran too hot. For floating island, the leftover whites were whipped stiff, sweetened, and poached into soft, snowy mounds set adrift on the golden sea of custard. It was a dish that wasted nothing, yet looked like extravagance itself. Oral histories recall the bride's mother hovering over the kettle, stirring without pause, while the household held its breath. Served cool in a glass bowl, the islands trembling on the surface, it drew admiring murmurs from guests who rarely saw anything so fine. To make it well was to prove a frontier kitchen could rival any in the settled East. Number 7. Country ham was the pride of the smokehouse, a great salt-cured haunch that had hung curing and aging for a full year or more, kept safe through the seasons for exactly such a day. After the autumn hog killing, the best ham was rubbed with salt, sugar, and pepper, hung in the smokehouse over slow hickory coals, and left to age until the outside grew dark and the inside turned deep, rose, and intense. Cutting into it was a ceremony in itself, the first slices carved thin and laid out in fans on the platter. The flavor was powerful, salty, and complex, a year of patience in every bite. Settler accounts treat the wedding ham as a measure of a family's standing, for only a household that had kept its hogs fat and its smokehouse full could afford to give away a prize ham. Tucked into a beaten biscuit, it was the frontier's finest mouthful. Number 6. Roast wild turkey crowned the savory table when a family had a sure hand with a rifle and a stroke of luck in the woods. In the days before a wedding, the men went out at dawn to bring back the biggest gobbler they could find, sometimes a bird weighing 20 pounds or more. It was plucked, dressed, and stuffed with cornbread, sage, and onion, then roasted slow in a Dutch oven banked with coals or turned for hours on a spit before the hearth. The skin crisped dark, and the kitchen filled with a smell that promised a feast. Oral histories recall the turkey carried to the table whole, the centerpiece of admiration before the carving began. Wild and lean, far stronger in flavor than any tame bird, it represented both the bounty of the frontier and the skill of the men who tamed it. A wedding turkey was a hunter's gift to the bride. Number 5. Fried chicken was the dish that signaled a family had truly emptied its yard for love. On the frontier, hens were kept for their eggs, far too valuable to eat lightly, and a chicken in the pot meant a real occasion. For a wedding, the bride's mother might sacrifice a dozen or more birds at once, a small fortune in eggs forfeited, plucking and cutting and dredging them in seasoned flour before frying them golden in deep iron skillets of lard. The platters came to the table heaped high, the crust shattering, the meat juicy beneath. Children were warned to wait until the grown folks had taken their share. Diaries from across the frontier describe fried chicken as the dish guests remembered longest, the smell of it frying on the morning of a wedding rousing the whole household. To serve so many birds at once was a staggering generosity, proof that on this day nothing was held back. Number 4. Barreled oysters were the most astonishing luxury an inland frontier family could place before their guests. A taste of the distant sea hauled hundreds of miles by wagon and rail, packed in salt and ice or sealed in tins and casks. Oysters traveled from the coast deep into the prairie at great cost, and to serve them at a wedding was the height of extravagance. The bride's family might scallop them with cracker crumbs and butter, or simmer them into a rich peppery stew thick with cream and milk. The smell, briny and strange to children raised far from any ocean, drew curious crowds to the kettle. Oral histories from the Great Plains recall whole settlements marveling that such a thing had reached them at all. An oyster supper at a frontier wedding was a boast no one could miss, a family declaring that distance and expense meant nothing against the joy of the day. Number 3. Burgoo bubbled in a great iron cauldron over an open fire, the communal stew that fed an entire settlement at once and simmered through the night before the wedding. Into the pot went whatever the community could gather: venison, squirrel, chicken, beef, or mutton, along with corn, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, and onions, all stewed down for the better part of a day until the meats fell apart and the whole thing turned thick and dark and impossibly savory. Tending the burgoo was a job passed between the men through the long hours, stirring with a wooden paddle the size of an oar. Oral histories from Kentucky describe burgoo as the dish that turned a wedding into a gathering of the whole valley, ladled out by the bowlful to anyone who came. No single family could have made it alone. It was the taste of community itself. Every neighbor's contribution melted into one steaming pot. Number 2, the whole roasted hog was the grand centerpiece that announced a frontier wedding to every nose within a mile. In the days before, a pit was dug, hardwood was burned down to glowing coals, and the family's best hog was set over the heat to turn slow for the better part of a day and night, the men taking shifts to baste and tend it. The smell rolled across the fields and told arriving guests, long before they could see the cabin, that a true feast awaited. When the hog was finally lifted whole onto a plank table, the skin crackling and the meat falling from the bone, a cheer went up. Settler recollections describe entire wagon loads of kin arriving for the roast, plates piled high. To give a whole hog was to give the smokehouse's future, a year's bacon and lard surrendered in a single day, all for the honor of a daughter's marriage. And finally, in first place, the bride's cake crowned the frontier wedding as the rarest and most precious thing a family could possibly serve. This was no humble molasses gingerbread, but a tall, pale cake built from pure white flour, real butter, a dozen eggs or more, and the costliest ingredient on the whole frontier, fine white sugar hoarded by the cone and ground down by hand. To bake it, the cook beat the batter by arm until her shoulder ached, for there was no other leavening to be trusted. Then came the frosting, a snowy boiled icing of yet more sugar and egg white, smoothed over the cake until it gleamed like fresh fallen snow. Oral histories tell of guests driving 40 miles by wagon for a single slice, of brides keeping a sliver, pressed and dried, for years afterward. In a world where sugar meant wealth and white flour meant arrival, the gleaming white wedding cake was the family's proudest declaration. It said, plain as day, that for this one shining moment they had spent a year's wages to give their daughter the finest day the frontier had ever seen. These 25 feasts were never just food. They were a family, pouring everything they had saved into a single afternoon of joy, a way of telling the whole valley that love was worth more than a year of wages. Which of these would have stopped you in your tracks? Tell me in the comments. And if your own family carries a recipe from these old frontier tables, I want to hear it.